How did your grandfather preserve enough venison to feed his family for an entire year without a freezer? And why have we forgotten every single method he used? The answer is not complicated. Your grandfather understood something about meat that the modern hunting world has almost completely lost. He understood that preservation is chemistry, not temperature. A freezer slows bacterial growth. Salt kills it. Smoke kills it. Acid kills it. Pressure and heat kill it. Your grandfather had 4 or 5 methods for putting up venison that kept meat safe and edible for 12 to 24 months on a shelf in a root cellar with no electricity, no vacuum sealer, and no chest freezer humming in the garage. I grew up watching my uncle do this on a farm in northern Maine, where the power went out for days at a time every winter, and nobody panicked about the meat because the meat was already preserved. He had mason jars of canned venison on a shelf in the basement that were 2 years old and tasted better than anything I have pulled out of a freezer bag after 6 months. Stay until the end, because the last method on this list is the one that changed how I process every deer I harvest, and it requires nothing but a knife, a bag of salt, and 14 days of patience. No special equipment, no electricity, just chemistry and time. The first method your grandfather used, and probably the one he relied on most, was pressure canning. This is the technique from the reference video that most modern hunters have either never tried or are afraid of because the word pressure makes people nervous. It should not. Pressure canning venison is the single most shelf-stable preservation method available to a home processor, and it produces meat that is fully cooked, tender enough to fall apart with a fork, and safe to eat for 18 to 24 months without refrigeration. The science is simple. You pack raw venison chunks into sterilized mason jars, leaving about an inch of headspace at the top, roughly the thickness of your index finger. You do not add liquid. The meat produces its own juice during processing. You seal the jars with 2-piece canning lids, place them in a pressure canner, and process at 10 to 15 pounds of pressure depending on your elevation for 90 minutes. The combination of sustained heat above 240 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than boiling water can reach at normal atmospheric pressure, and the sealed anaerobic environment inside the jar destroys every bacterium including Clostridium botulinum, the organism that produces botulism toxin, which is the only serious safety concern in home canning. Your grandmother could explain this in 2 sentences. Modern hunters act like it requires a chemistry degree. A buddy who processes deer for a living in NE, Minnesota, taught me the Italian beef variation 3 seasons ago. You pack the venison chunks tight, add a couple of sliced pepperoncini peppers, half a teaspoon of Italian seasoning, a 1/4 teaspoon each of garlic powder and onion powder, 1 beef bouillon cube, and half a strip of raw bacon for fat content since venison is so lean. Seal it. Process it at 10 pounds for 90 minutes. When you open that jar 6 months later, you have shredded Italian beef that is ready to eat in the time it takes to heat a skillet. My wife, who tolerates most of my hunting projects with varying degrees of patience, ate 3 sandwiches the first time I made this and asked why I had not been doing it for 20 years. I did not have a good answer. The honest answer is that nobody taught me. My generation was the first one that grew up believing a chest freezer was the only way to store meat, and we lost an entire library of preservation knowledge in a single generation because electricity made it feel unnecessary. The one rule you cannot break with pressure canning is the equipment. You must use a pressure canner, not a pressure cooker, not an instant pot, not a water bath. A water bath canner, which is the big pot with a rack that people use for pickles and jams, does not reach high enough temperature to kill botulism spores in low-acid foods like meat. Venison is a low-acid food. It must be pressure canned. A decent pressure canner costs $80 to $120 and will last 30 years. I bought a Presto 23-quart canner 6 years ago for $89, and it has processed over 200 jars of venison without a single failure. The gasket has been replaced once. That is it. The canner itself will outlive me, and probably my kids. That is roughly the cost of 2 or 3 trips to the butcher for processing, which means it pays for itself the first season you use it. And unlike a chest freezer, which costs $400 upfront plus $5 to $8 a month in electricity for the rest of its life, a pressure canner has 0 operating cost after you buy it. The math is not close. I made the mistake of trying to water bath canned venison my first year, Because I read something online that said it worked. It does not work. The jars sealed fine and looked fine, and I am lucky I threw them out before I ate them. Because a water bath processed jar of meat is a botulism incubator, sitting on your shelf looking perfectly normal while producing a toxin that can kill you. Pressure canner, not optional, not negotiable. If someone online tells you water bath canning is fine for meat, they are wrong, and following their advice could put you in the hospital. This is the one point in this entire video where I will not hedge. Meat requires pressure canning. Period. The trim and preparation matter more than people think. Cut all visible fat off the venison before you pack the jars. Venison fat does not preserve well. It goes rancid faster than the lean meat around it and produces an off taste that ruins the entire jar. The silver skin, that thin bluish membrane on the outside of muscles, cooks down completely during the 90-minute pressure cycle, and you will not even know it was there. I spent an hour on my first batch trying to remove every trace of silver skin before a buddy told me to stop wasting time. He was right. The pressure and heat dissolve it completely. The fat is the enemy. The silver skin is not. I trim my venison for canning the same way I trim it for jerky, which is to say, I am obsessive about removing every visible streak of white fat and completely relaxed about the silver skin. That one adjustment cut my prep time in half and improved the quality of the finished product, because I stopped cutting away good lean meat, trying to chase membrane that was going to dissolve anyway. Everything in this video, plus 60 more field-tested techniques, is in The Buck Hunter's Bible, 90 pages of deer behavior science, scent control, scouting methods, stand placement, and rut phase tactics with a quick reference card you can take to the stand, link in the description below, QR code on screen. The second method your grandfather used was salt curing, and this is the one that goes back centuries before canning was even invented. Salt curing works through a process called osmosis. When you pack meat in salt, the salt draws moisture out of the muscle fibers and simultaneously creates a concentration gradient that is too hostile for bacteria to survive in. A salt concentration above 20%, which is roughly 1 pound of salt per 5 pounds of meat, prevents virtually all bacterial growth, including the organisms that cause spoilage and foodborne illness. Your grandfather did not know the word osmosis. He knew that a deer quarter buried in rock salt in a barrel in the root cellar lasted all winter, and most of the following summer without going bad. The salt did what cold does, just through a different mechanism. Cold slows bacteria by reducing their metabolic rate. Salt kills bacteria by pulling the water out of their cells through osmotic pressure. The end result is the same: meat that does not rot. One method requires electricity. The other requires a $4 bag of rock salt from the farm store. The technique is simple. You take a boneless venison roast, rub it thoroughly with a mixture of 2 parts rock salt to 1 part brown sugar, pack it into a crock or a food-grade bucket, and cover the entire surface with additional salt mix until no meat is visible. Weight it down with a plate and a clean rock or a jug of water to keep the meat submerged as it releases brine. Store it in a cool location, 35 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to see your breath in the room, for 14 to 21 days depending on the thickness of the cut. A roast the size of a football needs the full 21 days. A thinner flat cut, maybe 2 inches thick, roughly the width of your fist, needs 14. After curing, you rinse the salt off, soak the meat in fresh water for 12 to 24 hours to pull excess salt out of the surface, and hang it in a cool, dry location, or wrap it in cheesecloth and store it in the root cellar. Properly salt-cured venison keeps for 6 to 12 months without refrigeration. It is dense, flavorful, and ready to use in soups, stews, beans, and any slow-cooked dish where the salt content becomes a seasoning rather than a problem. I started salt-curing venison on a property in eastern Montana 4 years ago, after reading about it in an old Outdoor Life magazine from 1978 that I found at a yard sale. The article described a rancher in Wyoming who had been salt-curing elk and mule deer since the 1940s, using the same crock his father had used before him. I tried it with a whitetail hindquarter from a November doe, and the result was better than any commercial corned beef I have ever bought at a grocery store. The texture was firm, but not tough. The flavor was concentrated and savory, and it sliced clean with a sharp knife after a 2-hour soak to pull the excess salt. I served it with cabbage and potatoes on a Sunday evening, and my neighbor, who does not hunt, asked where I bought it. I told him it was a white-tailed doe from his back fence line. He did not believe me until I showed him the curing bucket in my garage. The texture is firm, the flavor is concentrated, and the shelf life without electricity is measured in months, not days. The third method is smoking, and this is the one that most people get wrong because they confuse smoking for flavor with smoking for preservation. Smoking for flavor is what you do on a weekend with a pellet grill and some hickory chips. That is not preservation, that is cooking. Smoking for preservation is a different process that requires lower temperatures sustained over a much longer period, typically 12 to 72 hours, at temperatures between 80 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit, using dense hardwoods like hickory, oak, or mesquite that produce phenol compounds and formaldehyde in the smoke. Those compounds penetrate the surface of the meat and create a chemical barrier that inhibits bacterial growth and oxidation. Combined with a salt cure applied before the smoke, the result is meat that keeps for months in a cool, dry environment. Your grandfather built a smokehouse on the property. It was not a fancy offset smoker with digital temperature control. It was a small wooden shed, maybe 4 feet by 4 feet, roughly the size of a phone booth, if you remember those, with a firebox dug into the ground outside and a pipe running the smoke into the bottom of the shed. He hung salt-cured strips of venison from hooks in the ceiling, built a small smoldering fire of green hickory or oak in the firebox, and let it smoke for 2 to 3 days at temperatures low enough that you could hold your hand inside the shed without discomfort. The result was venison jerky and dried smoked strips that kept all winter and well into spring. I built a cold smoke setup out of a cardboard box and a soldering iron with a tin can of hickory chips 2 seasons ago in New Hampshire during a November processing weekend. Total cost was about $15. The jerky it produced was better than anything I have bought commercially, and it lasted 3 months in a paper bag in my garage without refrigeration. I am not going to pretend my setup was elegant. My wife walked into the garage, looked at the cardboard box with smoke leaking out of the seams, and asked if I was trying to burn the house down. I was not, but I understand why she asked. The jerky came out dark, dense, and smoky in a way that no store-bought product can match, because commercial jerky is made with liquid smoke, flavoring sprayed on thin slices in a dehydrator. Real cold-smoked jerky, the kind your grandfather made, absorbs actual smoke compounds through the surface over 48 to 72 hours, and the flavor difference is the same as the difference between instant coffee and a fresh ground pot. One is a product, the other is the real thing. The commercial jerky companies know this, which is why they add so much sugar and salt to compensate for the lack of actual smoke flavor. The fourth method is the one that requires the least equipment and the most nerve, and it is the method your grandfather used every single fall in cold climates before electricity was standard in rural homes, hanging the whole carcass in cold weather. In temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that water is close to freezing, but the meat itself does not freeze solid, a properly field-dressed deer carcass hung in a ventilated shed or barn will age and preserve simultaneously for 7 to 14 days. The cold slows bacterial growth to near zero. The air circulation dries the surface of the meat, forming a hard outer crust called a pellicle that acts as a natural barrier against contamination. And the enzymatic process of dry aging, where the muscle's own enzymes break down connective tissue over time, produces tenderness and flavor that no wet-aged, vacuum-sealed package from a processor can match. Your grandfather hung his deer from a gambrel, which is a spreader bar that holds the back legs apart, in the barn or on the north side of the house where the sun could not reach it, and he left it there for a week or more before he ever touched a knife to it. The internal temperature of the carcass was his only concern. As long as nighttime temperatures dropped below 40 and daytime temperatures stayed below 50, the meat was safe, above 50 degrees for more than a few hours, and bacterial growth accelerates past the point where surface drying can control it. That is why this method works in northern Maine and any Minnesota, and does not work in South Carolina, Low Country, or South Texas, where November temperatures can hit 75 degrees at midday. Know your climate. If your November nights do not drop below 40 degrees consistently, this method is not for you. Use canning or salt curing instead. Those work in any climate. I hang every deer I kill in cold weather now. The last 3 seasons I have hung carcasses for 7 to 10 days in my pole barn, in temperatures that range from 28 to 45 degrees, and the meat quality difference compared to deer I processed immediately is not subtle, it is dramatic. I ran a side-by-side comparison 2 seasons ago on a farm in eastern Montana, shot 2 does on the same evening, same field, same caliber, processed one the next morning, hung the other for 9 days at temperatures between 30 and 42 degrees, cooked backstrap medallions from both in the same skillet with the same seasoning. The fresh processed backstrap was good, fine. Normal venison, the 9-day hung backstrap was something else entirely, tender enough to cut with a fork. A depth of flavor I cannot describe, except to say it tasted like the best steak I have ever eaten. And it came from a 120-pound doe that cost me 1 round of Federal 3006. The backstraps after 10 days of hanging are as tender as beef tenderloin, and the flavor has a depth that fresh processed venison simply does not have. I am not a meat scientist, and I cannot explain the enzymatic process in terms that would satisfy a food safety professor. But I can tell you that every old-timer I have talked to across 5 states says the same thing, which is that the best venison they ever ate was hanging in a barn for 2 weeks before anybody cut it up. Look, everything I am walking through here is in the Buck Hunter's Bible. 90 pages, scent control, scouting, stand placement, rut tactics, plus a quick reference card for the stand. Link in the description, QR code on screen. The method I promised at the beginning, the one that changed how I process every deer, is a combination of the first 2 techniques applied in sequence. You salt cure the trim pieces, the shanks, the neck meat, all the scrappy cuts from the front shoulders that most guys grind into burger. You cure them for 14 days in a salt and brown sugar rub, in a food-grade bucket in a cool garage or basement. Then you rinse them, soak them for 12 hours, chunk them up, and pressure can them at 10 pounds for 90 minutes. The curing step pre-seasons the meat and gives it a corned beef flavor profile that is rich and savory without any additional seasoning in the jar. The pressure canning step makes it shelf-stable for 2 years. The result is jars of ready-to-eat seasoned venison that taste better than anything you have ever made from a deer and require 0 freezer space, 0 electricity, and 0 worry about power outages ruining 200 pounds of meat in July. I processed a full doe this way last November, using the front shoulders, both shanks, the neck, and the rib trim. I got 14-quart jars from one animal. 14 jars of fully cooked, shelf-stable, seasoned venison that my family has been eating all year in sandwiches, tacos, pasta, soups, chili, and straight out of the jar with crackers on a Tuesday night when nobody feels like cooking. My wife opens a jar, heats it in a skillet for 5 minutes, and dinner is on the table. That is a level of convenience that a frozen block of ground venison cannot touch because the frozen block requires 24 hours to thaw and another 30 minutes to cook. The total cost of the jars, lids, salt, brown sugar, and bouillon was about $22. A commercial processor would have charged me $80 to $120 to turn that same trim into sausage or burger that would take up half a chest freezer and be worthless the first time the power goes out for 48 hours. The old-timers did not have freezers because they did not need freezers. They had salt, smoke, pressure, and cold air, and they understood that those 4 things do the same job a $400 chest freezer does, except they do it without a power cord and without a monthly electric bill. Every deer you kill this fall has 30 to 50 pounds of trim and scrap cuts that most hunters either grind into burger or throw away. That meat is the perfect candidate for canning and curing because the small, irregular pieces pack into jars perfectly and cure evenly because of their thin profiles. The front shoulders alone on an average doe yield 8 to 10 pounds of boneless trim, roughly the size of 2 large bags of ice from a gas station. That is 6 to 8 quart jars of shelf-stable protein from cuts that most hunters treat as the throwaway pile. You are sitting on 10 to 15 jars of shelf-stable venison per deer, and you have been grinding it into burger and cramming it into a freezer that is already full. Try 1 batch this season, 1 doe, front shoulders and shanks. Cure for 14 days in a food-grade bucket in your garage or basement. Can for 90 minutes in a pressure canner you can buy at any Walmart or hardware store for under $100. Open the first jar in January and see for yourself whether your grandfather was onto something. He was. He always was. And the next time your power goes out for 3 days in January and your buddy is panicking about the 150 pounds of venison in his dead chest freezer, you are going to be sitting at the kitchen table eating Italian beef out of a mason jar by candlelight with zero concern. That is the difference between storing food and preserving food. Your grandfather knew the difference. Now you do too. And the deer in the freezer have been waiting long enough.